Hey everyone, welcome to Be the Change. My name is Lily Mott, and today's episode is about how change comes when you make your voice heard. My guest this week is Ishaan Shah, and he is the founding director of Stolen Dreams, co-founder of the Youth for Freedom Collective, and an advisor to UN Women, the UN Youth Office, and the UN Network on Migration, as well as other entities within the UN. He was also the United Kingdom's first youth delegate to the UN's Commission on the Status of Women. It was so great to learn about all of Ishaan's work, and he introduces all of these different roles much better during our interview. So, without further ado, let's get started with this episode featuring Ishaan Shah.
I'm Ishaan Shah. I'm 21 years old, based in London in the UK. I am the co-founder of Stolen Dreams, which is a youth-led collective working to combat modern slavery and human trafficking through education, advocacy, and policy. I started that back in 2017, and now it's an international collective. We're working on predominantly engaging young people in the space as a way of prevention, but also as a way of partnership and in policy-making processes to make sure that young people, especially young people with lived experience, are really centered in decision-making spaces. And then my parallel life, my alter ego is the UN sort of stream, and I wear several different hats across the UN system, predominantly focused on centering gender equality, so women's rights, girls' rights, and on meaningful youth engagement too.
That is a great introduction, Ishaan, and I'm so excited that I got to meet you. And now that I get to have you on the podcast, I would love to get started by just having you give a quick intro about your background and what got you motivated to start doing this work. What was that path like for you to get involved in activism? Take me all the way back to the beginning.
All the way to the very beginning. So I have been brought up using or practicing the faith of Jainism. So it's a faith that's very much principled on service to others. So from a very young age, I've been brought up in a way to always, put yourself before others, to always think about how privileged and how many resources we have, and to literally do everything by giving back to others without expecting anything in return. So that's from a very young age been taught by my grandparents, my parents, and something that's really been ingrained into my life throughout my time here on this planet. And the specific focus then on modern slavery was when growing up, we went to India quite a lot, met with children, and those happened to be children who were either survivors of modern slavery or were vulnerable to modern slavery. And at the time, I had no idea what modern slavery was. I mean, we were taught at school that slavery was abolished in the UK in 1833. Wiped off the face of the earth, eradicated. And that's obviously far from true. But it was in 2016 that I found out that modern slavery existed. And I was outraged because I thought, well, I'm finding out slavery exists, but I've just been taught at school through an education system that's meant to, equip children with life skills and the correct knowledge to contribute to all spheres of life. But I found out that slavery still exists. And I found out that this is not just an issue happening in faraway countries or communities, but it's happening on our doorstep. It's happening in the UK, it's happening in London. It's literally happening, in the clothes we wear, the foods we eat, potentially even the device that you're listening to this podcast on. So, it's very much all around us. And that's when my parents and those around me told me, well, you've met children who have survived modern slavery and human trafficking. And these were some of the happiest kids I've ever met in my life. And obviously the life that, children who are living in situations of poverty live in India is very different to the life that we live here in the UK. And noticing that difference as well between how happy they were, how selfless they were. So, when we sat down to eat food, they would always offer the food to others, to me and, my family and the other guests there first before they ate themselves. So there's very simple things that, we don't see really transcend in life amongst young people, right? We're all stuck to our phones, stuck to our screens, and we're all very self-interested. So, I mean, that was probably the aha moment. And it was also this noticing a lack of youth engagement in the space. The climate movement was bringing young people, the gender movement was bringing young people, albeit to a limited extent in terms of awareness raising. But the anti-slavery sector and the anti-slavery movement, and I wouldn't even call it a movement as such, because it's very much reserved to the academics, the people who have spent 30 plus years in the space, the people who collect the data. And I think that now we're seeing a lot more young people engage in the issue, but also a lot of young people going and working in organizations or in spaces where they actually have a role to do with tackling modern slavery in supply chains or in other aspects of modern slavery too.
It is really important for people to understand more about this issue. As you've touched on, we just don't talk about it that much in the public. I want to shift gears a little bit because I really want to get your thoughts on how you manage to balance all of these different commitments. You just finished university, and congratulations on that. So that's at least one less thing on your plate, but you're an advisor for so many different entities, and you're engaging in advocacy in so many different forms, and you're also a co founder. How do you manage to juggle all of these different commitments? And how do you also balance all of that work with your personal life and your mental health? Tell me a little bit about that.
Good question. And it's something that I don't have the perfect answer to because it's something that I'm still struggling with at the moment, but just finished university, as you mentioned. So one less thing on the plate, although I've not really seen it manifest in terms of how much free time I have. But yeah, it's really, I really think it's an individual journey in terms of how you balance your time and what you want to prioritize and focus on. I would advise people not do what I'm doing and juggle 7 million things at once. It's just not sustainable. And I think that, I'm sure you know as well, the burnout is a real thing, right? And I people will often think that young people use burnout as an excuse, and it's a myth until they actually face it themselves. And then they'll see how awful it is, bedridden and fever, just like a utter sense of demoralization, pessimistic outlook on life, right? You lose all that hope and that drive and that motivation that we as young people need, and also recognizing that we're young and we're in this for the long run, and we need to be sustainable in the way we do our work and our activism. I would really say to focus on the issues that you're passionate about. I mean, as young people, I think a lot of us are so driven to solve every issue in the world. And that's just because a lot of us are just good people and we want to do the best we can to make sure that we're making the world a better place for, everyone on earth, but also for our peers and for future generations as well. But I think it's about understanding there are so many young people out there who are already doing great things. You just find your niche, the part that you're most passionate about, the part that gets you up in the morning, and the part that also allows you to have that balance between investing your life and soul and blood, sweat, and tears into the work, but also balancing it with taking some time to look after your well-being and mental health. And for me, I think I've managed to find that through a community of people. I don't think necessarily I'm not very good at managing my time in terms of forcing myself to have free time, but I very much rely on the people, the friends, and the community around me that I've made along the way. And we always check up on each other. We always check in on each other. When one of us notices that we're not performing our best, for example, we'll say, well, are you okay? Maybe take a day off, take a breather, because we know that if we're tired and we're exhausted and frustrated and, just demoralized and whatever, that we're not going to be doing our best. By nature of the work we do, the work is important, right? It impacts people at the end of the day. The policy we influence impacts people at the end of the day. So we have to be on our A game all the time. So I think that's the message, is to find your niche, find the issue you're passionate about. Always listen to your body, listen to how you're feeling. So, if you feel like you just can't do it, ask for help, take some time off, take a breather, and then also just really connect with your community, find your people. It doesn't have to be people who are in the activist space either. A lot of my friends don't do activism. They're just people and they exist, and they support me and I support them. And I think that's what you really need to have around you. And I think that's a really important factor.
I think that is all such important advice. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I want to shift back to your work and talk a little bit more about the work that you're doing as an advisor. I would love to know what a day or maybe a week in your life is like as you're working with all of these different entities within the UN and you're just juggling all of these different roles. Can you tell me a little bit more about your work with the UN?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. And I think when I was at school, we were taught about the UN. It's the global governance institution of the world. It's a force for good. It's a state where the member states come and just shout at each other, for example. Yeah, that's what we were taught, right? And then I really didn't think that I would ever fall into the UN world, but I accidentally slipped and tumbled into it in 2021 time with UN Women. And UN Women is the agency responsible for gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls in the UN system. And they were holding the Generation Equality Forums, which is it was an initiative done in 2021 to really mobilize movement building, but also financial commitments around investing in feminist movements, feminist movement building, and women and girls in particular, to accelerate progress towards gender equality. And I was invited to speak at the Commission on the Status of Women, which is the largest intergovernmental gathering of member states to advance gender equality. And it was all virtual at the time. This is pandemic time, COVID period. So it was a virtual sort of parallel event happening. And I was brought into that space to speak about modern slavery and human trafficking, especially of women and children. And I was the youngest person on that panel. I was the only man on that panel as well. And it was very much a tokenistic role, right? That's the reason they invited me, was because I checked those two boxes, young and a man, and talking about gender equality. And I felt tokenized, but I'm glad I took that opportunity on board, because I met a bunch of incredible young feminists who are working with UN women in the UN space, and connected with them over our shared frustrations about, how tokenized and patronized, and just how we're not treated as equals, and how we're not treated as partners when it comes to decision making spaces. And that's when we, as a youth constituency in UN Women, sort of said to UN Women, you can't have a process like generation equality without meaningfully including young people. And in response to that, we wrote something called the Young Feminist Manifesto, which is a beautiful piece of art. It's a document that really talks about how we need to move beyond youth participation and look at youth partnership. So looking at co-leadership, co-creation, co-ownership, seeing young people not only as beneficiaries of change, but as partners at the table, and not just a tick box to validate a process, but actually at the table, making decisions, being power holders. And I think that that was a really transformative process, because that was my first introduction to sort of feminist multilateralism, feminist global governance, and a feminist outlook of decision making. And I think that's really informed. And I tell this story because I think that's really informed my work, the way I conduct myself, and the way we carry out our work as an organization, as well as Stolen Dreams, in the spaces that I occupy, is always driven by those feminist principles of power sharing, of decolonial approaches, accountability, transparency. So yeah, I fell into the UN system with UN Women. We did some work at the next Commission on Status of Women, the 66th session in 2022, to actually influence the intergovernmental negotiations. So really taking those grassroots demands of activists and translating them into policy, so into UN language for the member states to adopt in the resolution. And we noticed that actually the work that we were doing on gender equality was confined to this one UN process. And it wasn't spreading across the UN system. The UN is a monster of an organization. It's got so many branch and arms and tentacles. There's so many different processes, and it covers every issue on earth. But the stuff on gender wasn't really coming out of that New York bubble. So we decided to pop it. And we said, okay, let's try and follow and track as many intergovernmental processes as possible, and get the language, the core fundamental language on women's and girls' rights in those processes. And yeah, that's what I've been doing ever since. So advising several different UN agencies on gender equality, on meaningful youth engagement. And then the other part of the work is on modern slavery and human trafficking, and the UN Office on Drugs and Crime covers that issue. That's their mandate. And that's under the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. So that's the Convention on Human Trafficking that was adopted in 2000. And now, over the past few years, it's had a review process, and we are the youth focal point for that review process. So essentially telling member states, what you're doing well, what needs to be worked on, and how you can engage more young people in preventing trafficking in your national capacities.
That is amazing, and I think that was such a great overview of all of this work and how it's different, but it all comes together. And I think a lot of your work touches on how young people can not only participate, but as you mentioned, should really be partners contributing to making change and helping to make important decisions. Lots of young people want to create change, but they may not know how to get started with that work. What advice do you have for those people who may be listening?
Yeah, well, I would preface this by saying that, I think activism in this day and age has really evolved. And even like the narrative around activism and the perception of activism has shifted substantially. When you have like sort of influencers who also brand themselves as activists, I think it starts to conflate what true activism really is. It's not necessarily about having 7 million followers on a social media platform and being verified, or it's not necessarily doing some of the work that we do. And speaking of the UN, for example, I think it's all down to what happens at the grassroots level. And in my opinion, it's also all down to the accountability that you exercise as well, to your government, to your decision makers, but also in an increasing sort of multipolar world, also the private sector as well, and their complicity in some of the biggest abuses of people and planet today. I think where to start is, one, don't feel daunted, because that's how I felt when I was 13 years old, finding out modern slavery, and I said, I want to do something. I was scared and I was confused, because I was like, where do I even start? Modern slavery in itself is such a broad and complex issue. But I found the area and found the gap, and the gap was youth engagement, and the gap was the narrative as well. It was, how is modern slavery being communicated to young people? And it really wasn't being communicated to young people very effectively. It was a lot in academic terms, in data terms. in business terms, but not so much in how can your everyday person understand that actually the products that we consume and use on a day-to-day basis are made not necessarily by machinery, but actually by people's hands. And those people are exploited. Those people are probably living parallel lives to you, as a young person with same aspirations and same dreams, but they're actually in situations of forced labor or debt bondage or domestic servitude, whatever it may be. So it's definitely to find the area that you're most passionate about, and then to map out sort of what sort of change you want to see as well. Like, is it policy change? Is it an awareness change? Do you want to do something within your family? Like, do you want to sort of have a talk about what your parents do in their professional lives, for example, and see how actually they can become activists in the space that they occupy? I think activism is so diverse. It's just about finding what you're interested in and start somewhere, because that first win will boost your confidence. The amount of times I have made mistakes, at times I've failed, probably too many times to count at this point, but it's about having that healthy relationship, right? I think, again, you can bring cancel culture into this as well, I guess, but it's about holding yourself accountable as well and saying that actually, at the end of the day, we're human, we're young, we don't have as much years of experience. We may hold expertise and we're experts in our own lived realities, but that's okay. We're young, we can make mistakes. We can, mess up a few times or as many times as you want, as long as you learn from those mistakes and as long as you see it as something constructive as well, something to really move on for. And the third piece of advice would be always ask for help. You're not alone in your activism journey. There are millions of other young activists doing very similar things to probably what you're interested in. There are also older people that you can speak to, that you can rely on, that you can ask for help. And I think that that's really important, is that collaboration with your peers, but also intergenerationally. So never be afraid or daunted to ask for help. No question is a silly question, is what I've learned in the activism space, because the work you do is important and you want to get it as right as possible. So if you don't ask questions, then yeah, how do you learn?
I learned so much from talking with Ishaan and was so inspired by his work. He is doing great work to raise awareness about modern slavery, which is an issue that really doesn't get enough attention. And he's also doing great work to advocate for youth representation in spaces of power. Throughout our conversation, I kept thinking about how Ishaan has really become a great advocate for others by making his voice heard. He has worked hard to put himself in positions with Stolen Dreams and with the UN where he can really raise awareness about the issues that others face. And I think Ishaan's story is a great example of how change comes when you make your voice heard. Thank you so much for listening to this episode, and you can find Ishaan on Instagram and LinkedIn, and I've also included those links in the description of this episode. If you want to talk about anything I mentioned, please reach out to me by email at lily@bethechangepodcast.org or on Instagram at Be The Change Media Network. I am working on expanding Be The Change Media Network, which means bringing you more inspiring stories from amazing guests. If you enjoyed this episode, I would really appreciate it if you could leave the podcast a rating and a comment, because it will help these stories to reach, educate, and inspire more people. And I would also love to hear your thoughts and feedback. Tune in for my next episode, but until then, be the change you wish to see in the world. Bye, guys.